Hi, welcome to the Sourdough Simpleton. I'm Mark Levy, the Simpleton, and today we're going to make a different loaf of bread than the one we made in the previous episode. This is a round, more traditional sourdough bread. It's called a rustic loaf, and again, this recipe is from the King Arthur Baking website. I'll have a link to that website in the text for this video. This is the kind of a sourdough which, when you think of sourdough, comes to mind. The round loaf with the slits on top and tastes really good. So let's get to baking this. It's a really very simple recipe, and I think you're going to be able to do it without too much difficulty. Just follow along and it's pretty clear. First of all, we're going to make sure we've got all of our ingredients set out for us as we're going to need them. That makes things more convenient when you're actually doing the baking. Okay, so we're going to begin with the flour. This is about 5 cups, or about 602 grams of all-purpose unbleached flour. Put that in our mixer. And to that we're going to add about a teaspoon of yeast. Now this is a regular instant yeast, and this recipe is going to use some yeast to give it a little bit of boost. If your sourdough starter isn't quite so active, you might want to use a little more yeast, up to say 2 teaspoons, but we're using about a teaspoon. And we're using 2½ teaspoons of salt. This is uniodized or salt which does not have iodine in it, which is what I usually use for baking. And then we're going to use our sourdough starter. This is 1 cup of a very nice active sourdough starter. We'll take the sourdough starter and put it in. This was fed this morning, and took the day to get nice and active. And then finally, a cup and a half of, we'll call it warm or lukewarm water. Put the hook on the mixture and turn it on. We're going to let this go for maybe 10 minutes or so until the yeast and the salt and the flour and the sourdough and the water are all incorporated into a nice dough. And if necessary, if it's running a little bit too loose, you can add a little bit of flour during that process. If it seems to be very dry, I'd add a little bit of water to that, but be careful with that. Give it some time and let it mix together. So I thought I'd pop back in for a little bit just so you could see how this looks as it's mixing. It's been going now for about 2 minutes. The dough is starting to come together very nicely into a dough ball. We're going to give it a little bit longer to fully incorporate all the ingredients and develop a nice dough ball. And now about 2 minutes after that, we're about 5 minutes into the process, the dough has really formed around the dough hook, and the walls of the bowl are fairly clean. So getting your time to take this out. Well, it's been about 5 minutes, and the dough is now nicely surrounding the dough hook, and the walls of the bowl are fairly clean, so it's time to take this out and go into the next step. We'll turn the mixer off and remove the dough from the dough hook. And this is not a very sticky dough. It's not a dry dough by any means, but it's not a very sticky dough. Having taken the dough off the dough hook, we'll take the bowl out, and we're going to put this dough into a lightly oiled bowl to rise. And that's going to take about an hour, give or take, until the dough is approximately doubled in size. flip to make sure that all sides are covered by a little bit of oil. Take some plastic wrap, cover it over. And once again, this room is about 75 degrees, so we're going to let this rise at room temperature for about the next hour until it's about doubled in size. We'll see you then. So while we're waiting for the bread to have its first rise, that's right, its first rise, there are actually 2 rises for this bread, and each one's about an hour, hour and a half. I told you that sourdough was not something you could do quickly, and I mean it. So this is a recipe that's going to take a little bit of time to get through. But let's discuss some of the ingredients that we used in making this bread, just to clarify exactly what you should be using. To begin with, the flour. This is all-purpose flour, not bread flour, but it's unbleached. It's important for it to be unbleached because it seems as though some of the times when it's bleached, the sourdough just doesn't take well, doesn't grow well. So unbleached, all-purpose flour. Number 2, water. Now, you don't have to use bottled water. Tap water is fine. If you can drink it, you can use it. I usually use filtered water because our water does have a bit more chlorine in it than I like, so the filtering takes that out. When I said lukewarm, that means we want to warm it to about 100 degrees, give or take. It should feel nicely warm, not hot. Again, if it's too hot, you're going to kill the yeast or the sourdough. Speaking of yeast, we did use a teaspoon of yeast in this recipe. Kind of gives it a little bit of a kick. Again, if your starter isn't a very lively starter, you can use a little bit more, perhaps up to 2 teaspoons of yeast. This is instant yeast, the kind you would get in little packets and use for bread making or pizza dough or whatever else you like to do. This is not the block of raw yeast, but this is the instant yeast that comes in a jar or a little packet. We also use salts, and I had mentioned before, we use non-iodized salt, either sea salt or kosher salt, which is ground up usually, or I'm using actually a table salt, which is not iodized. And the reason for this is that the iodine also can inhibit the growth of the sourdough yeast that's being used. So these are the things that we're using to make this bread, and relatively straightforward, simple stuff. And we'll see how it comes out in about another hour, and we'll get back to you after that. See you then. Well, it's actually been about an hour and a half, so this dough is not fast. I told you it wasn't going to be fast. We'll take the plastic wrap off the top, and you can see that it's about doubled in size, give or take. We're going to turn that out. I'm using a Silpat mat because it protects the countertop from what I'm about to do. We're going to manipulate this just a little bit to get some of the air out. Make it into a little log. I'm not kneading it a whole lot, just manipulating it, so to speak. I've got a log here, about maybe 10 inches or so by about 5. Take a bench scraper and cut it in half. And we're going to have 2 loaves now. And we're just going to form these into some nice round loaves. That's one. And that's 2. We have a baking sheet with a piece of parchment paper on it. Just to be 100% on the safe side, we'll spray a little tiny bit of cooking spray on the parchment paper. Don't always have to do that, but we want to be sure this doesn't stick. And we're going to put 1 loaf on one side and 1 loaf on the other side. And again, to be sure that the plastic wrap does not stick, I'm going to put a little tiny bit of spray on top of the loaves. Take some plastic wrap, cover it over, just loosely, not tightly at all, because I don't want to inhibit this from rising at all. And now we have the second rise. And that could take hour, hour and a half. We're going to let it rise until it about doubles again. We'll see how that looks. So while this is rising, go have a cup of coffee or something. And once again, we will be back. So while we're waiting for the bread to rise again, another little tip for you. Have you ever had a piece of parchment paper, maybe from the end of the roll, and you try and put it out on your sheet and your baking sheet, and no matter what you want to do, it keeps rolling up and just won't lay flat? Simple way to fix that: take the parchment paper and give it a quick crinkle. Not a lot, just a little bit, and that will allow it to lie flat. All you have to do. So simple. Let's go back and wait for the bread some more, okay? Well, it's been a bit more than an hour, and our dough has risen nicely. As you can see, we'll take the plastic wrap off. Now, the next step for this is to put some water on it. You're supposed to spray it with water, but quite frankly, I don't have a sprayer, so we're going to use a pastry brush and just lightly brush a little bit of water over the top of this. Try and speckle it once so I don't mess up the top of the loaf. But this helps to form a nice crust. Maybe I should buy a sprayer. Something else to put on my list of things to do. And then after that, you're going to dust it with a little bit of flour, and you'll see this gives a beautiful look to the loaf after it's baked. Can't see much now with it, but it'll look very, very rustic and very professional. And finally, you score it. Now I'm using a bread knife, and you just make two very nice slashes in the loaf. And this is to allow for expansion as it rises in the oven. I think you can see that fairly well. And now you put it in the oven. Now the oven has been preheating for about 15 minutes at 425. And I started that while it was rising. It'll be in the oven for about 25 to 30 minutes until it's a nice golden brown color. We'll take it out and put it on racks and let it cool before we enjoy it. So you get the advantage of watching time go by almost instantaneously. For me, it's another half an hour wait, but we'll see what happens after that. Be right back. Welcome back. It's been about a half an hour and our sourdough has been in the oven. And it's just about time to take it out and take a look and see what kind of delicious bread we have come up with today with this rustic sourdough loaf. Once again, original recipe is on the King Arthur Baking Company website. Let's take the bread out of the oven now and take a look at it. We have two beautiful loaves of bread. Nice crust to them. And I'm sure that they're delicious on the inside. So take some time. Once again, this has been about 8 hours from start to finish. If you consider that I started with the sourdough starter, revving it up at about 9:30 this morning, and it's now about 5:30 in the evening, 5:15, but even so, that's about 8 hours all told for starting the starter, allowing it to grow to mature to be able to make the bread, doing the initial mixing, then the first rise, forming the loaves, the second rise, and now this resulting bread. It is a commitment of time to make sourdough, but it is worth it. So take a look at the recipe, take a look at the notes here on the page, and watch the other videos. Visit the website, sourdoughsimpleton.com. Visit the Facebook group, Sourdough Simpleton, and the YouTube channel, also Sourdough Simpleton. Send me a message at Mark, M-A-R-C, at sourdoughsimpleton.com, and let us hear from you. You can enjoy the world of baking. Next time we're going to try a loaf with no yeast. So we'll get a little bit more adventurous and see where we can go with that one. But for now, enjoy. This is the Sourdough Simpleton signing off. Take care.